All right, so good morning, everybody. Once again, my name is Kat McDonald, and I am the coordinator of the Monroe College Honors Program, and I am the immediate past president for the Northeast Regional Honors Council. So it is a pleasure to be here with you this morning in session 1, Zoom room 3. We have a great panel for you this morning. Our panel is entitled Brain Tricks, and we have 4 presenters. So our first presenter is going to be Taylor Bennett from Gannon University. Her piece is entitled Parapsychology, Why Do People Believe in the Paranormal? She'll be followed by Bethany Brenner from Kutztown University, A Good Death to Look Forward, Look Back. Then we'll have Ayanna Perez from the University of Hartford with her presentation, The Impact of Individual Ability to Visualize on Recall and Recognition Memory. And we will round out our panel this morning with Benjamin Portnoy from Russell Sage College, Physical and Neurological Plasticity of flow state on productive individuals and its effects on psyche. I cannot wait to learn a lot. I'm going to learn a lot from that one, I think. So what we're going to do is I will pass it over to each of the presenters who will have up to 15 minutes to make their presentation. I will use the chat to give you some time indications. So I'll give you a 5-minute warning, and then I'll give you a 2-minute warning, okay? And like we said, we're going to hold questions till the end. But what I want all of our participants to think about this morning is, questions for our presenters, maybe contemplate connections between presentations, contemplate our overall conference theme of infrequently asked questions, right? So hopefully we'll have some great conversation for the last 15 minutes of our session. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Taylor Bennett, who can now share her screen. And once you get started, Taylor, that's when I'll hit the clock. So welcome, everybody. So nice to have you all here, and to all the people who joined in on this session. All right, let's do this, guys.
All right, so like Kat said, I am Taylor Bennett, and I'm going to be presenting on why do people believe in the paranormal. First I have to learn how to go to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so paranormal is going to be defined as something that is unexplainable by modern conventional science, or outside of the range of what we would call a normal experience. To dig deeper into the paranormal, we can also define paranormal phenomenon, and these are experiences that consist of things like a seance, tarot card readings, dream diaries, psychic healing, ESP, out-of-body experiences, ghosts and the belief in them, spoon bending, etc. There is a lot that comes with what paranormal phenomena are. And believe it or not, about 45% of the population in the United States believes in ghosts, and 18% of the population actually believes that they have had encounters with the paranormal. Since that's nearly half of the entire US population, I thought it was relevant to understand why people believe in the paranormal. In psychology, the study of paranormal phenomenon is referred to as parapsychology, and this has been poked and prodded around for about 150 years. However, this area of psychological study is not really widely accepted by the greater scientific psychology community. It is considered a pseudoscience or a proto-science. However, in more recent years, the psychological community has actually begun to accept more and more this area of study after a phenomenal research paper that went out in 2018. It began to begin to understand why people would actually believe in something they can't explain by our scientific standards. First, I really had to understand what belief is. So why do people believe in what they believe? There's a huge distinction that we have to make when it comes to belief, and that is that there is a big difference between thinking and believing. Simply put, believing is often discussed when focusing on religious meaning, while thinking is used in terms of speaking matter-of-factly. This doesn't solely mean that belief has something to do with religion, but we can really think of it as linked with superstition, whether that be religious or paranormal superstition. So when we consider belief as a result of both the irrational and the unscientific, we just need to remember that just because something is irrational doesn't mean that it isn't real to the person who believes. And just because the belief itself may seem irrational and cannot be proven, the beliefs are still valid. In the end, my research really shared with me one big clue. People are going to believe in what they want to, and persuasion isn't always going to work. So now we've covered what belief itself is, and we can really ask ourselves if belief in the paranormal itself is valid. In 1985, a study was conducted to change what is called unsubstantiated beliefs, or these beliefs in paranormal phenomenon, in which the use of valid evidence and normal or natural explanations were used as an attempt to change a person's belief in the paranormal. The study here showed that persuasion or natural reasoning was not helpful and was not a helpful way to change a person's personal beliefs. Instead, using a scientific approach was more likely to change a person's belief in the paranormal. However, just because a few heads were turned doesn't mean that all were. Despite hard, cold facts in science, people are still going to believe in the paranormal. While there are many ways that research and science have proven that paranormal phenomenon and studies into such are unfounded, again, we still have believers, so that has to mean something. However, the more and more we dig into the studies of parapsychology, the more and more we're going to see that unfortunately, there's no definitive answers when it comes to finding the answer to our question, why do people believe in the paranormal? No matter what, people will still believe what they want. So we use the big R word, and that would be religion. And it's only fitting that we bring up this huge topic in parapsychology, and that is the relationship between religious believers and paranormal believers. Of course, like any debate, there's going to be two sides to it. That paranormal believers and religious believers are similar. And the second side would be that, of course, they are different. A person who believes that religious and paranormal believers share similar behaviors, emotions, or personality characteristics. They would point out that both believers in the religious and paranormal have a lot of crossover when it comes to supernatural beings and phenomenon that they experience when it comes to their behaviors, emotions, and physical or personality characteristics. While a person who doesn't believe in these shared qualities or believe in the fact that religious believers and paranormal believers could have these similar characteristics, they believe that those shared qualities would look at the difference in the ideas on things like life after death. While quite a few of these studies actually err on the side that the two belief groups don't share similar characteristics of like emotions, behavior, and personality characteristics, many would suggest that it comes down to belief and experience itself. So it comes down to this. There are going to be people who are more likely than others to have specific experiences that lead them to their beliefs. And this makes the argument that while fundamentally there is a difference in what they believe, it is the fact that they believe in what they cannot see that connects them. So now we're going to move on to what parapsychology has to say about these paranormal phenomenon. And we're going to use psychology as kind of a way to understand what is happening to a person when they say they're experiencing said phenomenon. Just to remind, the first thing is we're going to be looking at the connection between hallucination and the paranormal. Just to remind us, a hallucination can be defined as any uncontrolled sensory event that happens where there is no outside stimulus. When it comes to seeing these events, research says that there are 4 types of hallucinations to consider when trying to explain what's happening in these paranormal situations. Specifically, looking at what happens when the sharing of ghost stories happens. They are going to be hypnagogic hallucinations, highway hypnosis, REM sleep behavior disorder or somnambulism, and vivid hallucination. These hallucinations can occur in a person who is either suffering from a neurological disorder or someone who is your everyday person like you and me, pretty normal in terms of their brains. Most of those who share their ghost tales are actually found to have a hallucination while they are awake. Specifically, that's going to be 43.7% to be exact of people who have these hallucinations while they're awake. Meaning that experiences that they're having are actually happening while they are awake, whether it's a hallucination or not. And to see if those who have experienced a paranormal event, if this event is actually like a psychosis sort of thing, or if it's happening to them, they are then compared with neurological or psychologically disordered people. And it's actually found that they share a similar pathophysiology as to the hallucination itself. However, like with many cases in parapsychology, there is no definitive answer to whether or not the paranormal experiences are having a hallucination or if their experience is in fact real. Another really huge area that is studied in parapsychology is precognition. And this is primarily a person's ability to read the future, but it can also be looked at as things like walking visions, deja vu, intuitive thinking, or anomalous cognition. The reason this is so big is because of a study that was completed in 2011 by Daryl Bem, and his study, quote, proved that extrasensory perception, or ESP, or like we're talking about precognition, is real. He hypothesized that when an individual is exposed to emotionally arousing stimulus, they are going to have more of a strong physiological response than others. So what does this have to do with ESP? Well, what he had the participants do was look at a screen and guess whether or not this emotionally arousing visual stimulus, in this case, an erotic stimulus, was going to pop up on the screen. His results did in fact show that there was a positive correlation between these stimulus-seeking individuals and psi performance. And psi performance is like the ESP. Meaning that there is going to be a statistically significant number of people who are able to predict the future or predict if the next image that they were about to see was going to be this erotic stimulus or not. Of course, there is a side to precognition or ESP that is not real, and that side argues heavily that the biggest problem with these ESP studies is that they cannot replicate the studies. If you want to prove to the whole world in the psychology community or in a lot of science that what you're saying is real, you have to be able to replicate your study. Again, you have some people that agree with them in his 2011 findings, but others who believe these studies, who believe that this study is invalid, think that these studies rely on statistical failures as well as unconvincing arguments based on coincidental results, and therefore they would say that ESP is not real. There are many other things that you can look at when it comes to parapsychological studies. You can read into how paranormal events can be due to things like intentional blindness, and intentional blindness being that you're blind to things that we normally would not look out for or expect. Studies like these say that the higher a person would score in inattentional blindness, the more likely they are going to believe in the paranormal. Other research in this field looks at what is happening to a person when they believe that they've experienced some sort of extraterrestrial life event, or like a UFO sighting, or being abducted by aliens. Many research in this area actually looks at personality characteristics that those who spot the UFO or abducted by aliens or see like extraterrestrial life, they found that things like demographics could actually show whether or not a person would believe in extraterrestrial life or not. Specifically looking at like education, and that a person who has a higher education is less likely to believe than somebody who has lower amount of education. They're going to be the ones who believe in extraterrestrial life and UFO sightings. But this isn't just going to be people who are psychologically disturbed, but individuals, again, just like you and me, who experience these things. Another area to look into is mind reading, and whether or not there is any evidence that this phenomenon is real. Yeah, another area is going to be psychokinesis, and this is a person's ability to move objects with their mind. But what do most of these studies conclude? And that they are inconclusive. There needs to be more research done into these areas of study. So can we really accurately answer the question we sought out to find? Why do people believe in the paranormal? Unfortunately, most of the research that I've conducted never actually answered this question. Rather, most of the research was seeking to prove whether or not these paranormal phenomena were true and whether or not these people are in the right state of mind when they've experienced these phenomena. Most of the research focused on how individual differences between believers and non-believers plays an important role in the notion of such beliefs. In the end, we can see that there's always going to be people who believe in the paranormal, just like there's always going to be individuals who hold religious beliefs. More research must be done in order to understand why a person will believe in the paranormal. However, today, we can find more understanding as to what people believe and conclude that while some people might actually be crazy, people who believe in the paranormal are just as normal as you and me. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. All right, that was awesome. So there are a couple of questions in the chat that you can just kind of look at and contemplate, but that was really, really interesting. And I'll private message you. Mary Ellen sent me a question for you, so I'll send it to you so you can think of your responses to those. But those are really great. Yeah, let's do Zoom round of applause for Taylor, our first presenter. So that was awesome. All right, so now let's move along to our second presenter of the day. So I'm going to give the floor to Bethany. So Bethany, you have up to 15 minutes, and I'll do the same thing that I did in the chat, 5 minutes, 2 minutes. So you can share your screen. I can see it. All right, and just make sure you're unmuted.
Yeah.
And whenever you're ready to go, you can get started.
Okay, so hi, I'm Bethany Brenner. I use she, they pronouns, and this is my presentation, A Good Death to Look Forward, Look Back. Okay, so what are we looking forward to? What is a good death? Then technological innovations during the Civil War, new safe ways to mourn during COVID, a good death in a post-pandemic world, and how to have a good death. So what is a good death? Well, it's not just one thing. It can be personal, medical, cultural, or anything else. For our purposes today, we are focusing on the cultural notions of a good death when it comes to American culture, specifically the culture of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And a good death kind of just encapsulates the traditional practices and behaviors expected of the deceased and the deceased loved ones as they are actively dying at the time of death and after they have died. So, starting with the theological roots, the first is the Ars Moriendi. It's Catholic. It is a set of 2 Christian texts, the first released in 1415, more text-based, and the second released in 1450, which is 5 sets of paired images depicting temptation on one side and inspiration for the dead on the other to resist temptation. Jeremy Taylor then revised this in 1651 for a Protestant audience in his book, The Rules and Exercises of Holy Dying. The sections of this book include different sicknesses and temptations the dying would face, rules of visiting the dying, and preparation for a good and holy death. So by the time of the Civil War, a good death has become ingrained in middle-class culture, separate from religion, and just kind of a general belief system that's believed both in the North and South. Some aspects include the hour of death needing to be witnessed and last words heard, dying at home, and kin performance of death rituals. The Civil War. So the death estimates for the Civil War soldiers are around 620,000 in a 4-year period, though this number can get closer to 750,000 and 800,000 deaths when you include civilians. And kind of as a result of the Civil War, notions of a good death transformed to accommodate the realities of war. So the hour of death being witnessed and last words heard was not very common. When it did happen, it happened in prisons and hospitals or was done by the chaplain. Dying at home, also a large now. The technological innovations that we'll be talking about soon kind of allowed somewhat for this, at least in the transportation of bodies back home. And also soldiers would carry mementos with them to try to have a death at home in a spiritual sense rather than a physical sense. And then kin performance of death rituals, kin in the sense of their fellow soldiers, but outside of that, very rarely happened. So, technological innovations that enabled a good death. There were two significant developments. The first is embalming. This is the process of preserving the body to prevent decay. Before the Civil War, this was only used on medical cadavers for medical students to learn. This was kind of because it was a little bit taboo and not really practiced as much. But during the Civil War, this practice was more accepted as it allowed families to achieve that aspect of a good death of dying at home by being able to transport their loved ones' bodies back home. But this was only for people who could afford it. Oftentimes, when you were just a normal soldier, the winners of the battle would have to bury the losers of the battle. So usually, if you were on the losing side, you were just kind of buried in a mass grave. The same happened kind of on the winning side, but they were more labeled. But after the Civil War, especially after Lincoln's death, where he was embalmed and then toured around the country for about 2 weeks, it kind of becomes part of our accepted death culture and is a procedure that's expected to happen to the deceased. The second is refrigerated coffins. This doesn't stick around, both because it wasn't very effective and also because it was extremely expensive to the point of also being more expensive than embalming. But the idea of trying to keep corpses cool until they can be prepared has kind of carried over to today. This is most obvious in COVID-19, especially in New York, where we had refrigerated trucks to keep the corpses from decaying before they could be properly buried or cremated. Other developments. So, as a result of the Civil War, the United States implemented the following. The first national cemetery, Arlington National Cemetery, was kind of established as the mass amount of death just overwhelmed the system. They didn't have anywhere to bury bodies before this for soldiers, so that's just kind of why they decided to create one. Precursor to official letters to families. Soldiers would sometimes pre-write letters to families to notify them of their deaths, but oftentimes it was nurses, chaplains, and friends of the soldier who would notify them. It noted in that letter whether they died a good death or not. They wouldn't lie if they didn't meet like the notions of a good death that were prevalent at the time, which included repenting before death and accepting death. Yeah, and then a precursor to standard identification. None really existed. I believe about 40% of Union soldiers were left unidentified after the war. But some people did have their names inside clothing and identifiable items that were personal. And this mass amount of death kind of resulted in people realizing that they couldn't name everyone, but that they needed to in order to keep a record of kind of what happened. And so this eventually leads to the standard identification that really gets its footing in the Spanish-American War. Okay. So, a good death during COVID. An estimated 546,704 people have died from COVID as of March 29th, 2021. Changes to a good death throughout the 20th and 21st centuries kind of culminate in the reaction to COVID-19 and the way we interact with the dead. What do I mean by this? Well, basically, we're in a completely culturally different time period, which is more secular, more distanced from death, and more fearful of it. So our notions of the good death, as established earlier, kind of have faded more or less into the background of our lives. And this was a result of medicalization of death, which is basically medicine taking over the death sphere as we become better at staving off death until later in life. So the people who are taking care of the dead and dying are no longer the family, but medical practitioners and funeral directors. Also, cremation is now a large thing, but it was not very popular back in the Civil War. It was also a lot harder to do during that time period and just culturally not acceptable. And all of this is just kind of reflected in the way that we now treat people with COVID and our elderly when it comes to notions of a good death. So, compromises that enable a good death. So there were some significant developments. A virtual funeral. This kind of allows family members to gather to respect the dead and lay them to rest without physically being there to see them one last time. This allows way more people than normally would be able to come to a funeral, to attend a funeral. I believe I saw an article where like 90 people attended this funeral, which is always a good thing, but I feel that it could also distance us further from death, which I'll get into a little later. Then there is the memorial service, and the difference between a memorial service and a virtual funeral is that memorial services don't necessarily involve the deceased person in any capacity. Usually in a virtual funeral, the cremated remains or the body in some form is involved, but with memorial service, this is not the case. Instead, it's more focused on memory of who they were and celebrating their life. So the next is limited service. Service that only allows a certain number of people to attend in person. This may sometimes include funeral staff in the amount of people who can attend. One of the numbers I saw floating around was 10. So if funeral staff is included, that usually means that only 5 or 3 people from the funeral party themselves can actually attend. Sometimes there were drive-by funerals, which is basically exactly what it sounds like. So people drive by to see their loved one in their casket or to see their cremated remains while staying safe in their car. And kind of all of these measures reflect our increase in safety measures and our increasing distance from death, but especially the memorial services, which began to occur even prior to COVID-19. It also kind of somewhat fulfills the altered role of kin performance of death rituals, as kin used to be able to perform death rituals in the sense of washing the body, preparing the body before it would go into the ground or be cremated, that kind of thing. But now that's all kind of relegated to the funeral industry itself. So, a good death post-pandemic. There are a few possible influences the COVID-19 pandemic could have on a good death, which depend upon a number of factors. So, are we going to remember? This is kind of a 1918 flu pandemic versus the AIDS pandemic. And what I mean by that is, in 1918, the entire pandemic was kind of just overshadowed by the war. More people died from the pandemic itself in a shorter period of time than in the war itself. And kind of the results of that was that people didn't remember it. Culturally, there was like literature and media in that sense, but there wasn't an effort to remember as much as there was an effort to remember the war. And this could also be because of the war that soon followed in World War II and also the collapse of the economy shortly after World War I. So the next is returning to normal. So traditional ways of mourning versus new innovations. The traditional ways of mourning, as in physically being there to mourn the body, sometimes being there to see the wake, the cremated remains, versus continuing the virtual funerals, memorial services, taking out the seeing of the dead loved one at all. And I think the new innovations could absolutely be useful when it comes to virtual funerals, especially for people who can no longer travel. But I feel if we rely on them too much, we'll distance ourselves even further from death. And this kind of comes to the last point of acceptance, fearing death less versus fearing death more. So the pandemic could have the effect of we fear death less because we're now surrounded by it again. And we understand that it's just a part of life, even if the way that people are dying during this pandemic is awful, it's not something that we can't come to terms with. Or we're fearing death more, and because of the pandemic, we are shutting ourselves off to death even more, wanting to distance from it further, not wanting to interact with the actively dying as we already have been, but to such an extent that we're just kind of causing them to have a social death, which is when you're isolated from your peers to the extent that you're basically already dead without being dead. So that brings us to a final question. How to have a good death? Well, culturally, a good death is kind of seen as one where someone dies at home, among family, with their last words heard and their family taking care of them. But I can't tell you what a good death will mean personally for you. That's a personal decision. But I can tell you ways to help you prepare for your own death and come to terms with the fact that you will die. Discuss death openly. Don't hide it. Talk to your friends and family about what you want to happen when you die. And prepare. Get a living will, advance directive, or a will that will instruct people about your wishes should you be incapacitated or for after your death. So how to have a good death? That's up to you. Thank you.
I'm muted. All right, thank you, Bethany. That was awesome. So there are a couple of questions that popped up in the chat for you to contemplate while we kind of continue to move forward. We're right on schedule with our session this morning. And that was a really, again, another really interesting presentation. And I think really great comparisons between, handling of death in the Civil War to today. Your presentation echoed our, I guess it was a 2015 conference in Gettysburg. I was thinking about Gettysburg for the first part of your presentation, so thank you. All right, so now we will move forward to our third presenter of our panel, Ayanna Perez from the University of Hartford. So Ayanna, I will give you the floor, and once you begin, you can share your screen, and once you begin, I will start the clock. So we'll move on to our third presentation next. I can see your screen and I can see you. Excellent. So whenever you're ready.
Okay, so hi, I'm Ayanna Perez, and I'm from the University of Hartford. And today I'm going to be presenting on my research project titled The Impact of Individual Ability to Visualize on Recall and Recognition Memory. So just to give like a little introduction on some of the information I found while researching for this topic, mental imagery and the brain. So most of the studies that I found when researching the topic of visualization all sort of looked at the connection between mental imagery and brain processes, specifically memory and perception. When researching, the first person who ever really spoke about mental imagery was Alan Pavio in 1971, and he sort of set the standard in a sense of like looking at this topic and connecting it to aspects such as the brain and language and how we interpret symbolic representations in our brains. Most of the studies that I found were neural imaging studies looking at brain regions that are being activated while people are asked to visualize. And the common brain areas that were found responsible throughout most of the research studies that I found were areas responsible for visual memories, visual perception, working memory, and long-term memory. So there was a lot of overlap amongst various different areas of the brain when doing neural imaging studies on visualization. So some of the studies that were done on mental imagery were based on imagery ability. One of the common aspects that I found that was identified was vividness, so how vivid the images that people can create in their minds are. And one of the questionnaires that I found that was used was the Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire, which was created in 1973 by Dr. David F. Marks. And this pretty much is just a scale used and given to participants to self-report. And there's prompts and themes that are associated with each question. Is a set of 16 questions, and it's pretty much just to assess the level of how vivid of an image people can create. And for the most part, most of the studies that use this scale use it as a means of categorizing participants to look at categorizing them into good or bad based on how vivid their images are, and then looking at their brain regions again to see if there's differences in what's being activated while they're visualizing based on how vivid they report their images to be. So this led me to the question of whether individual difference in vividness impacts our performance on certain memory tasks that we can do. Because not a lot of the research that I came across really looked at how people performed on these tasks based off of their difference in vividness. So for my hypothesis, I would assume that when dividing participants into good or bad visualizers based on how vivid their images are, the good visualizers should perform better than the bad. based off of just overall, based off just like overall, what's the word? I guess like it will make more sense if you have a better, if your image is so vivid that it's almost like you can see it like it's really there, then you should be able to perform better because it's that strong. So for my study, I was able to get 40 participants to complete it. I did it online via Qualtrics as a survey because of COVID in order to stay safe. I chose an online option, and my study was broken into 2 parts. And so just as like, what's the word? I can't think. Just to like inform you, I had a total of 40 participants in total for the first part, but only 32 of those 40 came back to complete my second part. So for part 1, I asked participants to complete the Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire. And then once they did that, I had them look at a list of paired associates, which was a list of 20 unrelated paired word pairs that I created based off of words that I found from another study that had a list of object and scene words. And I had them look at this list for 3 minutes, instructing them to learn the pairs by using visualization as an aid and visualizing the pairs interacting with one another. And then once they did that, I had them complete a recall memory task, which was just, I presented them with half of the pair and they were asked to complete the pair. And there were 10 recall questions, and then a recognition task, which was, I presented them with 20 pairs, with 10 of those pairs being from the original list, and I asked them to identify which pairs did they recognize from the original list. And then for part 2, I asked them to come back after 1 week and complete the recall and recognition task again without looking at the pairs, just to sort of see memory retention and how much of what they initially saw stays with them after not looking at the words for a week. And for my analysis, I did a repeated measures or a mixed factorial analysis, looking at good and bad visualizers versus their performance on the recall and the recognition task for each part. So for part 1, I pretty much just divided them into good and bad based on their VVIQ scores, and I split them in half based on whether they fell below or above a score of 59. And for part 1, I just took their mean scores for recall and recognition. And overall, there isn't a lot of difference in how everybody performed. The mean average for recall is a 7.65, and for recognition is a 7.8. So not that much of a difference overall, whether they were good or bad on performance on each. They did slightly better on recognition, but none of the scores were significant in the interactions between recall and recognition or between the vividness that they reported. Good did slightly better than bad, but not enough for it to be of significance. And then for part 2, I did a different score to analyze their performance. So I took their scores from part 1 and their score and subtracted it by their scores from part 2 to look at how much they lost. So a bigger mean means that they lost more. So for recall, overall, there was a loss of 5.31, and for recognition, there was an overall loss of 2.97. So everybody, there was a bigger loss for the recall task than for the recognition task, which could be understandable, and this difference was significant. they overall had a harder time with the recall task after a week than the recognition task. And looking at the good versus bad, there was an overall loss for good of by taking the means of their loss for recall and recognition of a 4.525, and then for bad, overall loss of 3.7. So this difference wasn't all that significant, but it was sort of like one amongst the scores that were close to being significant, but not quite. The recall, the biggest loss was amongst recall for the good participants of a 5.8, which was very surprising. It was sort of very odd that that the good visualizers had such a great loss compared to the bad visualizers. And this was a very odd interaction to see. So for discussion, all but one of the results came out. All of the results except for one were not significant. The only results that were significant was the results for the different scores between recall and recognition scores overall. There was a significant difference in the fact that participants performed worse in recall than they did for recognition. And that can be pretty understandable because recall would technically be harder to do than a recognition task. And most of the effects for part one were not significant at all. They weren't really close, but some of the results in part two were a bit close to being significant, but they weren't quite. And so most of the interactions that I saw, we can only really make inferences and suggestions, but we can't definitively say that these are what's actually going on. So for the most part, there was better performance on the recognition task, and the good visualizers experienced a slightly greater loss for both recall and recognition than the bad visualizers, but it's not a significant loss. So I can't definitively say that this is an interaction that definitively means something because the results did not come up as statistically significant. There's a chance that something else was going on there that can't really be explained. Oops, sorry, wrong way. Again, because my results weren't all that significant, I can't definitively say much about it, but there are some suggestions based on the slight changes and differences between how everybody performed. So interaction between memory retention and vividness could be suggested. What else? Everyone in part two performed worse. They had a greater loss for recall than for recognition. And so it could be suggested based off the weird great loss amongst the good visualizers, specifically for recall, that people who express a stronger or more vivid mental image could experience a harder time answering memory tasks without a reference. But that can't definitively be shown, but it is a very odd result that came out of the data that I collected. So for future research, the suggestions that I have is more participants. I was only able to get 40 for initially, and only 32 came back for part two, which is where I got some a significant result, as well as for part two with the different scores. Some of the significant scores were a bit closer to being potentially significant than the results from part one. So I think more participants would be really good because it could lead to a more significant result if this were to be done again and retried. More control. This was done online, So I didn't really have a lot of control over the amount of time that participants spent specifically on vividness, the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire. So I think that more control just in the sense of making sure that everybody is doing it roughly about the same amount of time. When looking at the responses, I noticed that there was a big difference amongst certain participants on the amount of time that they spent for part one completing it. And the only variability that would be there for the amount of time spent would be on the questionnaire. So I think that more control and a bit of a more controlled setting with conditions permitting would have been a very helpful thing for me. And also more diversity. My sample was out of convenience sampling. I had a population of college students, specifically mostly introductory to psychology students. So there could be potential bias happening there with running a psychology experiment on psychology students. So I think a bit more diversity, maybe even in just, in age would have been resulted in different results, or possibly more diversity in just focus as far as like where the participants like expertise is, maybe getting a population who doesn't have a much knowledge on psychology and psychological processes such as memory would have been helpful in running this study. So for my conclusions, again, none of my results were significant except for the results in part two on the memory scores. There was significant chain difference between the performance on the recall and recognition based off of the different scores between parts 1 and 2, but nothing else was significant. There was no significance between vividness level and memory tasks. So most of my conclusions are just slightly there. They're just suggestions of possible interactions going on amongst the participants and their performance on the task. So I would suggest that it could be like further exam based on these suggested interactions, because there is something happening, but I just can't definitively say that it is happening because there was not significant results coming out of the data that I collected for this study. And thank you, that's all I have for today.
That was great. Thank you, Ayanna. So I think it's amazing that you did some original research and you got a number of questions in the chat for you to look at while we listen to our final presenter. I think it's always admirable to see when our students do some primary research and to see how they took on that process and what they've learned from it. So hopefully we'll get a chance to hear from you on that a little bit during the Q&A. So I'm going to turn it over to our final presenter this morning in this session, Benjamin Portnoy from Russell Sage College. So you can go ahead, Benjamin, and you can share your screen and give your remarks.
Sounds good. Let's see. Here we go. Can everyone see this and hear me?
I can see your screen. I can see you and hear you. So you are good to go.
Okay. Figure this out. Okay. Welcome to my TED Talk. I'm Benjamin Portnoy. I'm from Russell Sage College. Today I'm going to be presenting a literature review that I composed earlier this semester, and I condensed it all down to this presentation here. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at that email right there, portnb@sage.edu. So today I'm going to be presenting physical and neurological plasticity of flow state on productive individuals and if its effects on the psyche. So just because I have so much information that I want to feed all of you, I'm going to ask that you just think about this to yourselves. Have you ever heard of flow state before? What do you know or think flow state is? Just to get everyone's mind jogging in the right direction. So what am I going to be talking about today? We're going to go into the origins of flow. We're going to define and look at the components of flow. We're going to look at the plasticity of physiology in response to flow, how flow applies to successful individuals, and how we ourselves can achieve this state of flow. So the origins of flow, where did it come from? So we can think flow state to this man to the right. His name is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. It's a very interesting name to pronounce. He's of Hungarian descent. Actually, there's an 11-second YouTube video with over 100,000 views on how to pronounce his name. And we can credit this because of his experience as a child in an Italian work camp towards the end of World War II when he played chess and saw that chess was a physical activity, but it didn't have necessarily a physical reward at the end. So he was intrigued by this. Flow state was originally named in 1975. His research became relevant in the 1990s when Csikszentmihalyi was a college student and conducting research on artists and saw that these artists would spend many, many hours painting their works of art, putting in enormous amounts of detail, and then they would just toss it to the side and begin working on the next one. So we saw that this completely went against typical human nature and the incentive theory, which defines individuals, which says that individuals are motivated by the drive of an incentive and reinforcement of something achieved at the end. So we wanted to look more into this and explain why do these people become so obsessed and get so much enjoyment out of the process of completing something, not necessarily the incentive that you get at the end of doing that. So today, we named that became flow state. Today, we find that flow state is a popular science. It's studied not only in schools and businesses, but in many, many different aspects of all fields across the world in order to enhance productivity of people. So how did Csikszentmihalyi define flow? He defined it as a state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience is so enjoyable that people continue to do it even at great cost for just the sheer sake of doing it. Csikszentmihalyi defined 8 components of flow state in his book. Actually, I have the book right here. It's been following me around the past few months. Flow, the psychology of optimal experience. First one being challenge and skill ratio of an activity. The activity that an individual is performing needs to have a good challenge and skill ratio, because if the applicant's skill level is not developed enough in accordance to the challenge of the activity, that individual will most likely experience something what is termed in flow state as anxiety. And if the challenge is too easy and the individual skill level is too much, then that individual will experience boredom, which in either case, what likely occurs is that the individual will just stop doing the activity. They just won't be interested in it and just throw it to the side. So we need to have that skill ratio where the challenge and the skill level that the individual has is applicable to where the individual has to apply some skill level in order to achieve that challenge. It's right out of their reach. There's a merging of action and awareness, which means that there's no worry, there's no fear or distraction from the activity. The individual that's performing the activity is one with the activity. Step 3, or the component 3, the task contains clear goals. And with the clear goals, you're gaining immediate feedback from the clear goals. So you know what you're doing and what you need to do in order to accomplish what you want to do. There's extreme concentration of task at hand. There's a loss of self-consciousness when you're immersed within the task. There's a transformation of time. Usually what we find in flow state is that people typically experience an increase in or a decrease in time. So time seems to go by a lot quicker than it typically does. And then the final and last component is termed the autolytic experience, which I will go into later on in my presentation. So flow continued. Flow is an active state. It's not a dynamic. It's an active state, and it is dynamic. It's not static. What I mean by active is, for example, watching TV is not flow state. Although you might think you're experiencing extreme concentration, watching TV doesn't fall into the principles and components of what flow is. So Csikszentmihalyi holds the position that flow state needs to be an active process, such as reading a book, swimming, playing chess, things of this nature, surgery. So what is flow state essentially doing? Flow state is organizing the contents within our consciousness. Csikszentmihalyi holds the position that our minds are in a constant state of entropy, and that when we are in flow, we're investing all of our psychic energy in order to create harmony and order within our consciousness, and putting all the energy and resources we have in our minds towards one specific task and directing all that input to that one specific task. So that's essentially what I'm saying here. So just for an example, if we think about Michael Jordan, when he does a behind the back pass in one of his games, he doesn't think I'm going to do a behind the back pass and I have to, bend my arm behind my back, et cetera, et cetera. No, Because he's in flow, his consciousness and emotions are removed. So everything is almost automatic. He just understands within his mind, because of the psychic energy he's invested, that this is what needs to happen now. So the physiological changes, I'm going to go into that now. We see that in the prefrontal cortex, there's a largest change. Specifically, there's a down regulation of the prefrontal cortex. This area referred to as the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. Typically is the area where we tend to overthink, we fixate, and it's our self-conscious area where, you know, we blame ourselves for everything. And during the normal state, when we're not in flow state, it usually operates in beta waves. Beta waves are between 12 and 35 hertz and characterized as being anxiety dominant, having external attention. However, when we're in flow state, we find a large difference. We see that area goes through something called transient hypofrontility, which transient meaning temporary and frontality being the frontal cortex. And so this area of the brain actually changes, and we find that there's actually alpha and theta waves being used instead of beta waves. Alpha theta waves are a much lower hertz. They're between 4 and 12 hertz compared to 12 and 35 hertz. And they're characterized as being very relaxed, inward focused, and attention oriented. So here I'm introducing a few studies that I found that kind of allow you to see and understand how flow state is, how it works, what it is. The first one, performance and ease influence perceived speed by Witt and Sugovic in 2016. They actually found something really interesting. In tennis players, they saw that those at a higher skill level saw that the accelerating ball coming towards them was moving much slower than those of lower skill level. And baseball players as well saw they experienced something similar, only they also saw that the ball moving towards them was actually larger than that of players at a lower skill level. And so if we go on and we look at the next study I present here, flow states and associated changes in the spatial and temporal processing conducted by Bennett. He utilized 27 participants, all consisting of athletes and musicians, and asked them to do something that is known as a temporal order judgment task. And what they saw was that post-performance of this temporal order judgment task, the ones with the higher performance actually experience higher subjective flow states. And so when he evaluated this using a questionnaire known as the Activity Flow States Scale Questionnaire, abbreviated to AFSS, they saw the global mean was 3.4 out of 5, meaning that people experience various levels of flow state experiences, which contributes to the fact of it being dynamic, and that the spatial intention improved by 21 milliseconds, and that the just noticeable difference of temporal processing needed to separate two stimuli 75% of the time actually decreased by 5 milliseconds, contributing to what Witt and Sugovic found in 2016. So in addition to that, there are some more physical changes that we find, specifically within the body, not only the mind. While doing some research, when someone's immersed in a task, such as a piano player playing the piano, their muscles responsible for smiling, known as the zygomaticus major, are actually being activated without their knowledge. And there's also changes within the pre-ejection period of our bodies, also known as the PEP, is essentially the sympathetic nervous system arousal. It's a measurement. And in the study Investigation Flow State and Cardiac Pre-Ejection Period during electronic gaming use, they saw that in their study of participants who were 19 years of age without any prior health conditions, after 15 minutes of using these electronic gaming machines, also known as gambling machines, that they had a decrease in PEP, meaning that they had an increase in their sympathetic nervous system functioning, and they had reduced a detection of peripheral objects, so that attention narrowing, that focus that we find with flow state. So what is the autolytic self? Many people across many generations, from companies, from businesses, from different backgrounds, such as Warren Buffett, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Thomas Edison, are all examples of what is known as an autolytic self. An autolytic self is someone who's never bored, seldom anxious, involved in what goes on, and in flow most of the time. And so through my research, I actually found that Warren Buffett, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, specifically those three, conducted an interview where they credited their ability to be so successful due to their skill with focus and flow. And so although many of us may assume that this autolytic self, this characteristic of flow is unattainable, it sounds, pretty scary. How can someone never be bored and seldom anxious? It's actually something that we all go through many times throughout the day through activities across the board, and we never actually realize, which is one of the reasons why I got into this, because I was just so surprised. No one ever talks or tells you how to focus, how to be an autolytic self. So going deeper into this, I found something even more dramatic with flow, and that not only can flow increase our ability to focus, but actually flow state has been credited on saving people's lives many, many times throughout history. And so a few of the examples that I have here, I don't think I have time to explain everyone, but they all have extremely compelling stories. But I'll just explain a few. So Christopher Berney, for example, he was a prisoner of the Nazis who in his imprisonment spent time in solitary confinement during World War II. And he credits his ability to stay sane by using flow. So what did he do? He gave his mind food. He gave his mind food. And the way he did this was he looked around his little confinement cell or whatever was in there, and he looked at the different objects within that cell and asked himself, how are these objects made? Where did these come from? How effective are they? He essentially gave himself things to think about and became very, very immersed in the objects around him. And when he was done with one object, he would move on to the next. Why are these blankets so warm? How are they so warm? What are they made of? Another example is Tolis Tibor. He was a poet who spent many years during the repressive phases of the Hungarian communist regime. And the way a lot of intellectuals during that time were in prison, the way he stayed sane was by translating poems, and him and his fellow his fellow prisoners had competitions on who can translate the poem the best and who can recite it the best. And so by activating this flow state, they were able to keep their sanity and stay alive during these times of repression. So now, how can we achieve this ourselves, this autolytic personality, which encompasses all these flow state activities? Well, we can set clear goals that contain clear and immediate feedback. We can become completely immersed within a particular activity. We can concentrate our attention to what occurs directly in that moment. We can learn to enjoy our immediate experience, and we can make sure to secure the proper skill challenge balance of the task at hand. That's extremely important, one of the central aspects, and also clear any distractions at hand. And it's important to mention that flow is not something that can be initiated. You can do certain things to allow it to occur spontaneously, and you can help to increase its occurrence, but the more you try to initiate it, the more unattainable it becomes. So you can do certain things to facilitate it, but you shouldn't go into doing something telling yourself, okay, I'm going to achieve flow now. You should you should do these 6 steps, and by going through these 6 steps, you'll allow its occurrence to become more readable. And I believe that is it. Yep. So those are my references. Thanks so much. And yeah.
You ended exactly at 15 minutes. That was
Really?
You were in a state of, I mean, you must have been in flow. I mean, to know.
Exactly.
All right. So that was really great. And so let's give Benjamin a round of applause. All right. So there are a ton of questions in our chat. Okay. So I think what we'll do is let's work our way backwards. Okay. So what I'm going to say is, Benjamin, you can pick a question out of the chat that you received to answer, and then we'll go to Ayanna, Bethany, and Taylor. So, and again, I don't think we have time to address all of the questions, but if the presenters want to put their email addresses in the chat as well if people want to follow up over email, because again, we can't just go out into the hallway and continue a conversation in this virtual space. But Benjamin, is there a question in the chat that you'd like to address?
I'm looking through it right now. There's a lot of good questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of good questions.
There's a lot of good questions. So wow, there's a lot. So do you think flow state is achieved by people who enjoy and make a living speed running video games? I think flow state is achieved by everyone, whether we realize it or not, in a wide variety of different activities. Specifically about video games, yes, people do. But the thing about video games and like EGMs essentially is the same thing what I mentioned. EGMs are in that specific study were casino gambling machines, but video games are essentially the same thing. They use the same principles. So yeah, you can achieve flow in those states, but I don't know. It's an interesting argument because a lot of people, Csikszentmihalyi holds a position that it's not an active process because, you're sitting there, you're thinking, but I think video games does fall into flow because video games actually, I didn't include this in the presentation, but video games, I think in 2019, they spent $152 billion doing research for video games in order to find a way to make them more addicting. So essentially corrupting the different principles of flow state within ourselves. And so one of the main aspects of that challenge skill ratio in video games, they give the video game autonomy in the fact that the game will adjust itself based on your skill level. So if your skill level is not developed enough, the game will be easier than it is for other people in order to facilitate you to play that game. So you're not in that state of anxiety and you're not in that state of boredom. So I could really go on with that, but I hope that answers your question.
No, I think that's awesome. That was a great question. All right, so Ayanna, is there a question in the chat that you'd like to respond to?
Looking at Taylor's question about hallucinations, I thought that was really interesting. A question. I don't recall any of like the research that I looked into, like mentioning hallucination, and I don't know too much about it, but just like from, let me reread it. My mind's all over the place.
I can read it for you. So it says, you talked about how visualization can be so vivid that it can seem like it is real. Is there a connection here between these vivid visualizations and perhaps hallucinations? Could the vividness of the visualization come to a point where it would be considered a hallucination?
I feel like it could be considered a hallucination depending on the definition, and I'm not too familiar with the different types and what goes into categorizing a certain experience of hallucination as a certain type. But thinking of like visualization as like, for example, like daydreaming, like personally, like when I daydream, I feel like it's pretty vivid that it could possibly be considered like a hallucination. So I think, yeah, like I feel like there could be some parallels with that, specifically thinking about visualization when your eyes are open, specifically, maybe not when your eyes are closed, but yeah.
Oh, good answer. Good answer. All right. Thank you, Ayanna. So Bethany, there were a couple of good ones in the chat for you as well.
Yep, I'm going to answer, Bethany, what originally drew your interest to this topic, and it may be beyond the scope of your research, but do other cultures have similar concepts of a good death? So the things that originally drew me to the topic were threefold. I started my research in March of last year, and I was like going to focus on personifications of death in media, but then COVID happened, and I was like, maybe I should focus on real people. That might be a little bit more helpful. And so I focused on real people. The second is that I experienced a death at 7 and then have experienced many deaths since then. I just kind of wanted to get a sense of where my own losses fit into the cultural narrative about death. And then third was Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, specifically, I believe, volume 7 or 8, entitled The Sound of Her Wings, which introduces the character of Death, who is a teenage girl who both brings you into the world and also takes you out of it at the end of your life, which I thought was really interesting and just kind of inspired my entire death journey. As far as the good death in other cultures thing, yes, if you're looking at like proper versus improper ways to culturally bury someone, like I think at least in religious terms, when it comes to Judaism, the burial of the dead being within 24 hours, that kind of thing. There's also that in other cultures as well. I don't have enough information to really kind of form a coherent thought about whether a good death really exists in other cultures, but for our culture, it exists in the sense of both a proper death and also morally good. We seem to try to put death into this morally good and morally bad place when really death is immoral. It just kind of happens. So I think that's kind of an interesting approach. But yeah, there is kind of a sense of a good death in other cultures, but more in the proper ways to culturally die and less than like the term good death, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Good answers. All right, and we'll turn over probably one of the last questions that we can probably take is for Taylor. So Taylor, you got a couple questions in the chat. So I don't know if there's any that you'd like to address.
Yeah, so the one I'd like to talk about is that somebody asked, is the research culture specific or does it apply across cultures? And this is a really interesting question to me because I did take a cross-cultural psychology course, which was super, super interesting. And it did talk about paranormal experiences in different cultures. And that's kind of what really started me on this journey of why people believe in the paranormal. But the answer to that is every culture is going to be different in their acceptance of what of paranormal belief and whatnot. And that interestingly enough, part of my research that I conducted, some of it was, I believe, in Australia. I had a lot of research that people in Australia were conducting on parapsychology. However, a lot of the research that I found was based in the United States. And so I would say that safely, this research would probably be pretty culture specific, except for the few cases that I found with the results that I found in the Australian studies. However, one article that I do remember reading pointed out that, again, different cultures are going to accept paranormal phenomenon differently. So like cultures where shamans or like healers and stuff like that are ones that are going to be more widely accepting of these beliefs. And so they'll probably say like, oh yeah, the paranormal beliefs are real, you know, these things are real. And so they're going to be accepting it more. And it's just like asking yourself, well, why do people believe in religion? Well, it's like a very personal thing. And like I said, in my research, they're focusing more on these individualistic differences rather than putting people in groups, because that is what they found, like the amount of belief that people are going to have in the paranormal depends person to person.
Great. Well, and what I would say here today is, yes, big round of applause for all of our presenters. I think you guys did an amazing job. So I'm going to end the session with just a couple of quick public service announcements about the rest of the conference. So once you log out of this session, you can log into something else for session 2. We have our keynote speaker today at noon. And then later on this evening, Taylor is hosting our Zoom dance party. What time is that again, Taylor, for the students? Unmute.
Thank you. I do believe it is at 8 p.m. I just had it pulled up.
I think that's right.
8 p.m. tonight. Yep.
All right, so you can come back at 8 p.m. and you know, zoom back into the 80s with Taylor. The other thing that I'll just mention to all the presenters is I know that you guys have worked really hard on your projects, and if you have a written component, I want to encourage you to maybe submit it to Illuminate, our undergraduate journal of NRHC. So I just put the link in the chat for that. So, you know, you can read through all the guidelines and everything. I edit the journal, so if you have any questions, all the emails come to me. But it was a real pleasure to work with you guys this morning and to hear your presentations. I see lots of connections, and I hope you guys really enjoy the rest of the conference. And congrats once again. So I'm going to stop the recording here.